we all know, so we all heard about the Chandra X-ray Observatory. He has played an important part in the origination of the star-shade concept, which is now one of the most exciting exoplanet-related concepts. He is currently a chief engineer for the James Webb Space Telescope, NASA's currently largest flagship mission, due to launch next year. So he has worked on a whole range of topics that range from laser systems, tactical uses, or component engineering level, laser damage metrology, optical inspection, and technology development projects. He has a background in physics and engineering. He holds a master's degree in engineering and a PhD in engineering and a bachelor in physics from the University of California, Los Angeles. So we are working on a mission concept with John, so it's a real pleasure to have his expertise here and his ideas, and we thought it would be a great way for you all to learn about the opportunities and the exciting projects that are happening in the aerospace industry and the opportunities that that sector offers. So please enjoy the talk. And let's welcome
John. Thank you very much. Some of this you heard from Daniel. I'm going to give you essentially a curated tour of my career. Explain a little bit about what and how I did or participated in various aspects of a number of missions, some of which you've heard about, and the idea is to give you a little bit of a flavor of what it would be like to work in industry. The one caveat is, of course, times are different. You're not starting your career in 1982, so your mileage will differ. But the point being, I've had the privilege to work a large number of programs and learn and grow and have some fun and a misadventure or two along the way. And so I do particularly see myself as a non-traditionally trained engineer, so I prefer usually making overly long titles the term industrial physicist. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background of my career, how I came to be in this room, how this is really a decision I made very early in life and have stuck to it and have not regretted it. Along the side here, there's a couple of things that we won't talk about. This is a large chemical laser. Interestingly enough, this is the same test facility that was used to test the lunar module descent engine. Up on top is a representative of some laser damage work. I won't be talking about that in this particular case. And this is a picture of an A6. And my very first job as a responsible engineer was responsibility for the laser that fit in this little ball turret. So it's a wide variety of things. So the first thing I want you to get a feeling for is the breadth of opportunities that are available in industry. Likewise, I could have a couple of my colleagues here who've worked in very important but very narrow fields, some of which have been seminal to Webb, and for example, stayed in mechanical and thermal and had great careers. So you don't have to be a generalist, you don't have to be a specialist. It works a lot of different ways. That's one lesson I want to leave. I'm going to lead you through three curated examples that have some optics and astronomy content given the locale. So this is Chandra, but when I worked it was called AXAF. So another lesson is if you're going to change the name of a program, do it early. I get calls from my customer asking for Chandra drawings because they go in our system and they can't find them because everything's filed under its first name. So the first step on the road to enlightenment is calling things by their proper name. I want to talk through the origins of the star shade and how we creatively transformed one problem into another and took the first steps to showing the viability of this rather exciting technology back when it was a completely wacky idea, and now it's a real technology with a real technology program being talked about seriously. Talk about what I've done for the last 12 or 13 years of my extended internship, largely working a number of aspects on the Webb telescope. We'll talk about what a week on Webb is like. to give you a flavor. We'll talk about careers in industry in general, and then I'll take questions. So I'm really a second generation aerospace engineer. I grew up on stories that my father told me when he was in the Army of firing captured V-2s as a V-2 rocket, being launched in the air over White Sands. When I was a little boy and teething, my father would wave his keys across. This is the key fob that was on his key ring for his entire lifetime, and the one artifact that when he passed away, my siblings knew to go nowhere near because that was mine. And I want you to concentrate on the little poem that's on the side that says, "The skyline is a promise, not a bound." And so I had that dangling in front of my face long before I could read. Grew up on stories of America's answer to Sputnik that blew up on television twice. Was replaced and succeeded by Explorer, but it's worth noting that on its third launch and third 3 times the charm, Vanguard rose into space and today is the oldest man-made object in space. So I was raised on these stories of kind of adventure and intellectual daring, and so as a result, when I was about the era when this picture was taken up in the corner, having been told I was too nearsighted to be an astronaut, I have very thick, high prescription contacts on. This was 1966, so all the astronauts were 5'10", perfect specimens, not normal size. I decided, well, I'm not going to be an astronaut. I'll be a scientist instead. Didn't know what an engineer was, but I will argue that I've done that since then. I'll also point out that you know all 3 people in that picture. You should know the tall gent in the middle, and my brother on the other side is an actor, and you've seen him on stage and screen. I'll let you figure out who he is as I talk. And now you've met me, and I'm the little guy on the right. Grew up in Santa Monica, went to UCLA, originally was going to go off and be an academic physicist. I got an internship at Hughes, because at the time when I was working in the physics department, the minimum wage was $1.95 an hour, and I was working my way through school. I got this intern job that was going to pay $380 a week. Okay, I'll let you do the ratio. I could basically make my nut and not work during school, even if I worked for 6 weeks, and I would have money for an occasional movie or book or whatever. So quite unintentionally, I went off, said, I'll do whatever you guys want me to do. You're paying me $9 an hour. This is wonderful. Turned out that I liked it, so I actually changed some of my graduate school applications after the application deadline from all physics departments to physics and schools of engineering. Did what I would now call a trade study, opted to study engineering, went to UCLA as a Howard Hughes Fellow, and completed my degree in 1987, starting out working on tactical lasers. Actually was hired to work a perfect fit for a laser job at what was then TRW. I showed up on my first day and was told that job had not started, the contract hadn't been signed. We're going to assign you to go work for a couple of weeks on an X-ray telescope. I remember thinking to myself, what do you need an X-ray telescope? Reflective mirror. To absorb. I said, what kind of crazy place am I working in? Well, it was then explained to me that it was really grazing incidence and total external reflection. Again, that took me about a week to wrap my head around it. It's true, it actually works. That 6-week assignment turned into 9 years. First job never opened. So be it. So there is a strong role of fate or making your own luck that I also want to leave you with. Came out, I was a space science guy, back into lasers for a while. Really big lasers, megawatt class, really big. First experiment on the outside of the space station, the optics for the laser. Sort of back into business development. Came up with the star shape while we were chasing the TPFC contract, and then into web with various jobs, starting with technology development, responsibility for the integrated design of the system, and ultimately chief engineer. Okay, so we're going to make our first stop. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Chandra, some of the things that I did. So one of the things is that when I joined the program, this was the design. Looks a lot like Hubble because it was supposed to be a low Earth orbiting serviceable mission with multiple generations of instruments. This is what we finally built. Non-serviceable, highly elliptical orbit with 2 instead of 4 instruments and 2 gratings. As you'll see at the end of this talk, it was designed for 5 years. We just celebrated our 18th anniversary of launch and onward into the future. This is an exploded view of the spacecraft. It looks like a big nut. It fits on a screw. It's very interesting that when you look at it, most of what you view is payload. Same thing with Webb, even though the Webb spacecraft is staggeringly large if you stand next to it. If you were to lay down next to it, it would be bigger than you are. The grazing incidence mirrors, which was perhaps the hardest thing to do on this mission. Once they were integrated into a package, it was just simply a box that needed to be accommodated with fairly modest tolerances. The gratings, these objective gratings, they go back and forth. I say that they look like toilet seats. Don't say that around with project scientists, but I'll say it here. And it gives you a diffraction. The optical bench is essentially a big dumb tube. It's a really high-performing big dumb tube, but that's basically what it is. And the instrument module in the back, it also gives its name to the Integrated Science Instrument Module on Webb, was back here. And this is a table that moves back and forth and moves the various instruments underneath the X-ray image. And this is a picture of what it looks like. It's here because one of my jobs was to write the first requirement spec for it. Didn't write the last one, but I did write the first one. Here is an artistic representation of what the telescope looks like. These are grazing incidence mirrors, it's parabola and hyperbola. Think of it as a very funny-looking Cassegrain, maybe if you squint and turn your eyes. It's got a different name. It's a Walter Type 1. It's a reasonably narrow field of view instrument, but it just concentrates the X-rays, its pure geometry, onto the focal plane where they're collected. And it does have reasonably good imaging over a field. So Chandra itself was a factor of 10 times better than the previous telescope. So HEO, which was the previous American observatory, had about a 5 arcsecond full width, half power diameter. This is a half arcsecond. A sister mission launched by the Europeans was again in the 5 arcsecond class. So this is a very substantial step forward in spatial resolution. And that was its fundamental scientific reason for living, was to actually image and resolve the diffuse X-ray background and identify individual sources. So this is a representation of the 2 different data collection modes. The one where we have the gratings out and we form a single image. You're not going to bother me. And the second, where we have dispersed images. On the high energy grating, there's actually 2 periods. There's 2 bands. One on the outer 2 mirrors, the medium energy, the inner 2 being higher energy. They get dispersed in a crossways direction. These are CCDs that pick up the data. So here's a picture of what it looks like to polish these crazy grazing incidence mirrors. And here is the mirror assembly going together. This was very, very tightly toleranced. So basically, these mirrors lived at one temperature throughout their life. Their manufacturing, their assembly, shipping, testing, launch, and operations. It's about the spec is about 1/10 of a degree F. The actual operation of the flight thermal system is about 2 times better than that. So some of the things that I was involved in was the early X-ray tests. How many of you have heard of TRL-6? Okay, No, you haven't. God, I hope so. So TRL 6, Technology Readiness Level 6, indicates that a system is essentially ready for prime time. The technology was sufficiently developed for flight. We did not have that sophisticated terminology in the early 90s, but we followed on the heels of the production of the Hubble Space Telescope primary mirror. This was before the spherical aberration was revealed, and it was just annoyingly late and over budget. So Congress said, you must prove that you can build the outer two, the hardest two mirrors, by September 15th, 1991 at midnight, or if you can't do it, no program. We delivered the data on September 4th. It was a very close run thing. If you look carefully, the clean room here, which is the same clean room we did the mirrors in for Webb, has plastic sheeting. So we developed it. Soon after that, they said, well, we don't have all the money, and that's when we changed from serviceable and multiple generations of instruments to the final configuration. I also led some of our efforts in scheduling and running the ground calibration. This was a 6-month posting to Huntsville. This was 11 months. The process I derived as we changed the architecture, all of the alignment requirements. So all of the requirements that say how well does the mechanism for the grading have to repeat? How well does the focal plane have to be aligned to the mirrors to maintain image quality? All of those, I led that effort. Worked a lot on stray light. Here's a fun story. We had built the telescope, the mirrors, the instruments, and the phone rings, and it's one of the PIs who has either discovered or realized that our grazing incidence mirrors will also focus solar electrons, of which there are a copious amount in our energy band. This would be very bad. Basically, huge background, very bad. So he said, I have the solution. Just here, put this magnet array right where right. And so my boss, not knowing what was up, yelled for me to come in, says, so-and-so's upset, go make him happy. It was a typical assignment. And I looked at that and I said, oh, we're going to have a problem. Because basically where he wanted to stick the magnets, there was no structure. So there's essentially no there. I said, okay, I know what you want to do. This is another theme. I know what you want to do. I will figure out how to do it. So after everything had been built, we figured out how to incorporate the magnets and the tantalum baffles into the design, drastically reducing the background. The electron broom sits approximately 2/3 of the way between the mirrors and the detector and successfully deflects electrons into the side. It's a funny story if anybody wants to hear it. It's the only double all-nighter I pulled in my career, and it all, of course, has to do with units in calculating magnetic fields. It's a painful story, but if you want to know, I'll tell you. Funny thing is, I was right and the expert was wrong, which is the really galling part, but we'll get back to that. Dynamics, reaction wheel isolation. Again, another late discovery was that the reaction wheels that point the satellite would excite the mirrors. The alignment and tolerance on these are fractions of a micron and microradian. So if the mirrors are moving or ringing like a bell, they're out of alignment and it would destroy it. We had a great, beautiful presentation. I remember going in and meeting the new spacecraft manager and having 2 hours worth of view graphs, because in those days it was on plastic. And I got started, and we got into it in about 10 minutes. And I said, I'm going to stop you. And I'm thinking, oh God, we're going to get thrown out of here. Get ready to fight, fight or flight. And his manager looked at me and he said, John, what you're trying to tell me is that we don't fix this, we're going to fail. Yes, sir. Okay, then, let's save ourselves an hour and a half. Fix it. Then he threw us out of the room. And then also spent a lot of work on the aspect camera and aspect system. Because unlike Webb, this telescope does not point at a target. It dithers over the target. And the image is reconstructed by knowing where on the sky, the telescope is pointed when the individual photons arrive. So, as I pointed out, this was a publicity poster. We've got 17 years on orbit, so starting number 18 as of 2017, and this is also typically my example of what do I expect out of Webb. We had very similar 5-year life, extra fuel. We can talk about how we get all that extra life out of these design processes. I also like to talk about it with my friends on the business side who think we're actually over-designing, and the argument is by over-designing we actually save a considerable amount of money. Okay, so curated stop 2 is the search for life, and this is circa 2005. So this is my first time back in it. And so I'm going to remind you that detecting an exoearth is hard to see in reflected light. It's about 10 to the 10th times dimmer than the star. It's a good homework problem. Go home and try and do that. It's typically compared to detecting a firefly next to a lighthouse. We went to the library and looked up the luminance of a typical firefly and a typical lighthouse. It turns out that's an under-exaggeration. It's about 2 orders of magnitude harder. Okay, so it's a very challenging problem. Basically, you've got a very bright source really next to a really dim one. You've got to turn off the bright one to see the dim one next door. So your filtration has to be highly selective in terms of its angular frequency. And again, if you do the math, 1 AU, 10 parsecs, 1 nautical mile is about 9 millimeters. So this is just a wicked hard problem. So this wicked hard problem in the early years of the millennium resulted in a number of concepts. Number 1, an infrared interferometer to actually null out the light from the star. Detecting the exoearth is actually several orders of magnitude easier because a life-bearing planet is about room temperature. Go figure, that's where water is liquid. Right, so you get that radiation. It's a little bit easier, but the pain of that is you've got these huge baselines. You've got to maintain wavelength kind of control over the various pieces of the spacecraft, and it's cryogenic. So that was deemed a telescope too far. And the main concept was TPFC. It itself was a challenging design. It's a large mirror, okay, because you get very few photons off the exoearth, and internal occulting, and you have optical stability expressed in fractions of a wavelength, thousandths of a fraction of a wavelength. It's actually a little closer, 1/5,000 dynamically. Very challenging. Because this has got to include all thermal and dynamic disturbances. Now, my main job was figuring out how to build and compete for our design of this. We actually came up with a design I like a little bit better than the JPL baseline. Not surprisingly, it looks like a repurposed Webb that had much better momentum management than this particular design. Along the lines, I was at a meeting and somebody came along and said, did you read this story about this pinhole camera? And the professor had written a paper study to NIAC to build a pinhole camera. Pinhole camera essentially re-imaging the system, and then you fly the spacecraft around this kind of football field size focal plane. And this solves the extinction problem by physically separating, not extinguishing, but physically separating and removing the planet from the star. Cool idea. We build large deployments. So I put on my salesman hat, put on my check jacket, off to go see him. Said, hey, we'd really like to talk about building this pinhole camera. And as we started to talk about it, it became obvious to me that we had forgotten the diffraction from the outside. Oops, because you're going to get an image, right? You're going to get diffraction from here. You're going to make an image of the star, and it did not really kind of work. And I said, not to worry. We don't need to build the disk with the hole in it. We can just build the disk, right? Babinet's principle and all that good stuff. Still had the problem that you had to navigate and fly around and maintain stability around there. And I said, that's pretty hard. And so then the question came up, and this all happened in the space of less than the time of this talk. What happens if we could apodize the edge of this disk and essentially turn off the spot? As I remember the story, my colleague Will Cash said, "Oh, you can't do that." And I, in my typical contrarian fashion, said, "Why? It's not forbidden by any, show me the physical law that says you can't do that. It's just a math problem. You just have to be smart enough to solve it, right? And how do you get a scientist or an engineer to do anything? Or you tell them, I don't think you're smart enough to do that." So we both went off into a race to do it, and I'm happy to say that the professor kicked my rear end and found a solution. And basically, these hyper-Gaussian pedals, which we'll show you in a second, do extinguish the spot of Arago, essentially the diffraction coming around this disk, allowing you to extinguish the star, and at very shallow angles have unattenuated light from the planet coming to the telescope. So again, this is what's represented on this picture. We simulate the disk. We get our spot of Arago. It's a great story in the history of optics. If you don't know it, you should definitely. Everybody here should know it. You put on this funky pattern, and lo and behold, it goes away. I mean, it's gone. 10 to the 12th, 10 to the 13th, gone. So that was great. Turns out that it can be expressed in kind of an offset form. So there's a solid disk and a hyper-Gaussian. It's actually a family of solutions, so you can do it with different pedal numbers and stubbiness of the pedals, and they all have comparable performance, but different kinds of attributes. I did get to write the first paper on it, where we combined not only the ability to turn out the star, but also the ability to locate the shade in the right place so that you could actually look over and see an exo-Earth. So this was the first step. If you want to talk about concept maturity, finding this solution is concept maturity 1. You can do the most important thing. This shows that you could do the two most important things simultaneously. And this is the paper that launched it. I do remember looking into the audience. A third of the people were asleep. A third of the people were paying rapt attention, and I think the rest of the people thought I was completely out of it. It was successful enough that it got Webb in his solution on the cover of Nature, which is an achievement that I hold over my colleagues that represent how important nature is. Okay, this is all kind of nice, and that was all about 10 or 12 years ago. The question is, does it work? Okay, so while I was off working Webb, that was proceeding, and my colleague, Steve Warwick, who's now the program manager, was off doing it. Maybe you recognize the McMath Solar Telescope, and we ran an experiment there. I don't need to tell you that we actually ran the experiment at night, but the picture was taken in the day so you can see the telescope. So by doing that, we actually use the heliostat as a siderostat, so we can track a target on the sky. We put the star shade, it's a small star shade up there, and we reflect the light to get the significant path and shoot it across the parking lot into a telescope. So here is a picture of Vega, very bright star, because it's got a name and not a telephone number. We zoom in, okay, and this is what it would look like without the star shade. And we move in the star shade. And lo and behold, it reveals two stars that are in the catalog and two dimmer stars that we had a hard time finding in the catalog. It demonstrates this against an astronomical target. Now, this is in air. The Fresnel number is significantly higher than it would be for an exoplanet mission, but this is a second proof of principle. And this was quite a visceral demonstration that eventually retired everybody's saying, well, the diffraction won't work, it's a trick. Okay. So, curated stop 3, James Webb. I have pictures of the evolution of the design. Again, I'm reminding you that as Chandra evolved, as the star shade evolved, Webb looks significantly more evolved than it did in the proposal stage. It looks a lot more sleeker and composed. And the artwork post-CDR, this was about 2009 to 10, looks even more finished and polished. But it was my job to lead the system design all the way through the design process. So if you're not familiar with the Webb telescope, shame on George for not telling you, but basically it's designed to see the first luminous objects in the universe, understand the assembly of galaxies by being able to take images and data at less than the full redshift, i.e. baby pictures of the universe, pictures of adolescence, essentially explaining the Hubble sequence, with inside the galaxy, understanding formation of stars and planets, and potential interrogation of same, including all objects inside our solar system, outside the orbit of Mars. The design response to that is a passively cooled 6.5 meter telescope. This is larger than any current rocket fairing, so the design has to be stowable. This is as deployed. It's a large 22 by 15 by 12 meter structure with a 6.5 meter primary, passively cooled to 45 Kelvin. So the passive cooling requires an open architecture. It also requires an orbit that doesn't have bright things in the sky. And that's one of the reasons that we go to L2. We'll talk about that in a minute. Scientific successor to the Hubble and Spitzer telescopes. So very quickly, I just talked about it. The key architecture, and this is kind of fun, because the basic operating concept, the basic operating principle of Webb is very simple. You need a big, cold telescope to detect really faint infrared objects. So we built a really big telescope. We're putting it into the cold side. This side, once the sun shield deploys, never sees sun again, ever. And in fact, we try to make it see as little sun as possible during powered flight. So it gets cold and stays cold passively. There is no cryogen. So we're not mission limited by exhaustion of cryogen. There is a closed loop cooler that takes the long wave instrument focal plane down to the neighborhood of 6 Kelvin. Again, that's not expected to be open loop. That will just continue on and work. We achieve this cold radiative environment by a 5-layer sun shield. It's kind of fun. I'm in an optics school. It's all done by mirrors. Essentially, these are 4 V's. Each V allowing the heat essentially to walk out to space, and each layer shielding and presenting a colder environment so that less and less energy is absorbed to be re-emitted at each successive layer. Each of these are folded up and stowed in a structure called the unitized pallet structure. The beryllium mirrors were chosen because of their low coefficient of thermal expansion over the range we expect to operate. It's interesting to note that decision in architecture was made well into the program just before preliminary design review, and there was a low expansion glass competitor, but ultimately the beryllium mirrors won out. So here's a demonstration of what L2 looks like. I'll just let the cartoon run. We get to do a couple of things. We have an orbit that has no eclipses. So we launch in the morning, we ascend in the morning. There are no shadows, ain't nothing to make us go on the battery, except for the fact when we come off house power at the launch site at T-minus 15 until we get the solar array out at about 32 minutes after launch. That is the only time in the entire mission that Webb is on its battery. So that allows us, for example, to have a really tiny battery and spend more mass and resources on things that return science, make a bigger mirror and better instruments. It gets us away from the blockage of the Earth. Low Earth orbit is very inefficient. I told you that we reformed the Chandra mission. Originally, that was going to be a 15-year mission in low Earth orbit. One of the ways we actually shortened the prime science mission by doing a calculation of how many actual hours we could get on the sky from that low Earth vantage point. We could get more hours in 5 years with a highly elliptical orbit, spending most of its time away from the Earth, because the Earth wasn't blocking the majority of the sky. So being away from the Earth is a huge operational efficiency increase. We're also away from the thermal influence of the Earth. So even though the sun shield is an amazing device, it doesn't provide infinite attenuation. So the environment on the top part of the sun shield does depend, however weakly, on the environment on the input side. By keeping that constant, we maintain stability in the telescope longer, allowing us to take more long-term exposures. We have the requirement to point at a single target for up to 10 days without repointing. And then finally, if you think of the flat architecture, which is necessary to put a larger than a fairing-sized telescope into space and get rid of the heat, think of an Earth-centered orbit. At some point, one of the brightest three objects in the sky is above the horizon of the sun shield. When that happens, let's just ignore thermal effects. We're out of business. Too much stray light, too much scattered light. So we can't use an Earth-centered orbit. So a number of orbits were considered: the L2 proximate orbit, drift away, highly elliptical, and actually an inclined orbit. They were all traded very early. L2 was the preferred orbit. In fact, it's highly preferred for most large space astrophysics missions. But that's why the L2 orbit. So I've done a number of things. This is a very short list of positions. The yellows are before I was full-time on the program, so that was just, hey, you're somebody that can spell telescope. We need an engineer to go look at this. So I did the IRAD review. That IRAD was a test that actually proved that we could make the latches stable enough. I was a reviewer on, believe it or not, the first re-architecture of the Johnson test. There were two subsequent ones, but this one had to do with whether we were going to test with the telescope cup up, which is the current configuration, or actually on this crazy, gigantic, cryogenic elevator with the cup down to protect it, quote-unquote, protect it from contamination. The only problem is it required all of the aluminum in the free world and would have taken 7 lifetimes to cool down. Other than that, it was fine. That and the fact that you've got the telescope hanging upside down, yeah. So we got rid of that idea. Started with the Vesta test lead. This is actually the ground support equipment that held up 1/6 section and 8-foot section of the backplane. It's fun to note that this was 900 pounds of cooled aluminum structure to hold up a 60-pound test article. It's got actually magnetic dampers to allow the speckle interferometer to work, and was the first hardware that we delivered. Led the design integration team, the deputy systems engineer, I was the systems engineering manager, and then finally the chief engineer. So a list of things, and this is just a tiny list of things that we did. One of the ones I like the most is we solved our momentum management problem early in the program. Momentum management is the leading cause of propellant consumption when we get on orbit. It is the life-limiting challenge for Webb. Think of the sun shield, like my attitude control colleagues do, not as a beautiful optomechanical device, but as a horrible sail, right? And this horrible sail reflects the light, and if the center of pressure is not matched to the center of gravity, we get an overturning torque on the satellite. Light has momentum, no mass but momentum. So reflecting the light does impart an impulse. We integrate that impulse ahead of and behind the center of gravity, and if they're not balanced, you get a torque. That torque gets absorbed in our reaction wheels. Eventually, the reaction wheels go as fast as they can, and you've got to apply the brakes and start them over. Without having the telescope turn over, that means you have to expend thrust. We originally wanted to do that by adjusting the pitch of the front part of the sun shield. After careful examination, that was another not good idea. For a lot of reasons, compromised the thermal performance of the sun shield and was just bloody hard to do and analyze. So the decision was made to fix the shape of the sun shield. That allowed the sun shield to go off and do its thing. We decided to add the tab, that little trim sail at the back. But the one thing we needed to do was know where the center of gravity was going to be when we had to set the tab, which will happen in about a year. But we asked that question in 2008. So that problem fell on my lap, said, where could the center of gravity be? It's a relatively straightforward problem. If you know the design, you just do propagation of errors. A few 100,000 partial derivatives later, you've got this little tiny number, because it turns out it's not very sensitive. The hard part was the non-statistical part. You had to realize the design was going to change. In fact, the design changed radically. Right? We had not designed the spacecraft in 2008. We did not have a deployable radiator. Right? We did not know how much the instruments weighed. We didn't even know how much the ice weighed. So I came up with an algorithm that did it. I'm happy to say that we made a prediction of an egg about that big, which was acceptable. I'm not telling you that at the same time in the PDR that we were told we couldn't fly into Arion because our CG was in the wrong location. That's another CG adventure. Happy to say that as we modeled it, basically as a random walk, the design process of a random walk, the drunk has made it back almost exactly to the metaphorical lamppost, and our momentum solution is still good. This is key because this is going to define the lifetime of the mission. So that's one example. A couple of mid-IR straight light crises. Several times, that was sort of the vampire problem.
Many times.
More than once was too many. Sunshield hole alignment. This is a very fun problem. The sunshields layers are very large, 160 square meters each. They all have to fold up. Okay, you can appreciate that they have to be secured to those pallets, because otherwise they're all going to fall on the bottom of the spacecraft and get tangled, and that would be bad, right? So they have to be secured. So they're secured with a launch restraint device that has a hole. Okay, at the same time, these membranes are terribly thin. 50 microns is layer 1, 25 microns the upper layers. You can appreciate that they don't take much pressure difference across those membranes before they rupture. Also, right? So there's a series of several hundred vent holes, okay, that have been tested and designed to allow the 1 atmosphere of air at the launch site to leave in an orderly fashion and not break the sun shield. So all of these holes have to line up when we're stowed, but at the same time they have to not line up when we're deployed. And so proving that was the case with tolerancing was originally started by the sunshield folks. They couldn't get to a solution, so one of them sheepishly came to me and I said, sure, I'll do it how hard. B, it turns out this is kind of a fun problem because if you try to be elegant with it, it gets to be very, very hard. So I said, well, I'm not a really elegant kind of guy. I'm just going to do it brute force. So we did it brute force, and I did it with an intern, and we had a proof in about 6 weeks. Should also mention, since we're talking local colleges, that intern did go to the other school in Los Angeles, but he'll be fine. Some of the other things, a lot of work on the ground support equipment, kind of the unknown part for the one flight satellite. We have about 600 configured items of ground test equipment and tooling. Some of it actually harder to design than the flight hardware. Two of my favorites right now is the telescope simulator that's actually integrated on the flight hardware that represents the same mechanical properties and interfaces and will be used for testing, both vacuum testing and mechanical testing of the space vehicle here in the coming weeks. In the observatory bag. Okay, you can appreciate we have to keep this clean. We have to move it around from facilities, so we need to put it in a bag. Well, this bag itself is bigger than my first apartment by a factor of several, and has to have several rather special properties. So, did spend a lot of time on the bag. I've actually been in a few documentaries. It's been quite an amazing ride.
John, I think it's interesting to this audience the variety of things you did.
Yes.
But also, I think on the engineering side, 3/4 of the things on that list were unique challenges to this particular project. They weren't things that had been done previously.
They were not done previously. And that, to me, is part of the fun. I don't, I don't mind being told what to do, but like the magnets, I hate being told how. To the point where my mother taught me to cook. I like to cook. I'm a very good cook. I'm getting a brand new kitchen. The modeling is going along nicely, I hope. Soon to be done. My mother is not allowed in the kitchen when I cook anymore. When I tell me how to cook stuff, she has no idea how to do it. So, I'm a pretty simple character. A lot of people ask, what is a day on JWST like? So I randomly went back and pulled out my calendar for a typical week in 2015. This actually isn't overly busy or overly subscribed. My record is having 7 simultaneous meetings, which was really awesome because I just hid under my desk in the rest of the meetings. So typically it's kind of busy. It's not predictable. If I showed you the time evolution, I was never smart enough to actually go take snapshots as it would change hour by hour starting on Monday. Starting on Friday, this is all pretty empty. There's a few standing meetings, and then Monday morning they start popping on, and by Tuesday afternoon this thing is full. Okay. Again, I got sent back east to talk about conflicts and problems with the contamination bag, because it all started out with a phone call from the customer. I'm not happy. Okay, it's not predictable, and like students, you all know what finals week is like, except in this case, it's like that every week for 10 years. So you gotta realize it's a marathon and not a sprint, and develop a sense of how to fight the dragons. And the answer is you fight the closest dragon first. I don't care don't fight the biggest one, because the little one's just as nasty. He'll eat you in 2 bites instead of 1. And so we did that and triage. And the other thing is you have to recognize, I'll call them benign or friendly or cuddly dragons, right? There are sometimes problems got brought to my desk that people thought were an existential crisis, and they just weren't right. They're wrong. Right? So you can't react on everything. You have to develop an intuition and a realization. And this all leads to, hopefully, soon, one day late, in 2018. This is a frame out of our launch and deployment video. You can find it on YouTube. So I do want to summarize with some last words in case it's not obvious. I do love what I've done, am doing, and will do whatever that is. I don't know, and so here's a couple of other representations. Actually, this is the work that landed me here. This was a diagram out of a patent for novel chromatic correction for a traditional Fresnel lens telescope. I still have this 5-year-old in me every day. In fact, I have this picture on my desk. I look at it and I say, "Did you have a good day, John?" And as soon as I can say yes, I very happily go home and enjoy my night at home. And I do want to say that I do eagerly look forward to tomorrow's challenges, very much like the project that brought me here today, and the promise of the skyline. So I want to say thank you for listening. I'll take any questions.